Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Breen. If you noticed I'm losing my voice, that's because of these, obviously. Plus also I'm recording these a little bit later uh, than I normally do. But anyways, this is my revisiting, retrospective trip down memory lane to talk about record stores. Now, if you've seen Empire Records, the movie, or High Fidelity, the movie, or Pretty in Pink, the movie, you have a vague idea of what a record store kinda sorta was back in the day. It's basically a comic book store where they sell records instead of comic books. Basically what it is. More or less. Obviously, by and large, as a whole, record stores are extinct. Now, that's not to say there aren't still a handful of stragglers still floating around out there in some markets, because there are. There was one in Dallas. There was a pretty good store. But I imagine you're not going to find them outside of the major metropolitan areas, at least in the U.S. But when I say record store, there's two things I'm describing. One, and we say record store, more accurately, we mean music store, but I don't mean music store as in place where you buy musical instruments. We call it a record store because it's where you buy sound recordings. Sound recordings of popular artists. Records, tapes, CDs, 8-tracks, etc. In the 80s and backwards, they were literal record stores. They were just bins and bins and bins of vinyl records. Or wax records. A lot of people don't know this, but not all records were vinyl, which is why it's not necessarily accurate to call them vinyl records, because a lot of them were wax at once upon a time. But that's neither here nor there. Starting in the mid 80s and throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s, records, as we know them, the big albums, the big black albums that everybody are trying to buy today because of hipsters, those things went extinct. They had been replaced by compact cassettes, those little tapes, the mixtapes and things like that, the cassettes, audio cassettes, and compact discs, CDs. And when I say compact cassette, I'm talking about this, because that's what it's officially called, compact cassette. Those little itty-bitty ones that you put in your answering machine, those are called micro cassettes. So, don't come at me in the comments that I don't know my shit, because I do. Alright, anyways. But most people just called them cassettes, or cassette tapes, or tapes. Which is confusing because we also called our VHS cassette tapes, cassettes, or tapes as well. I know, it's confusing, but it is what it is. My mom called my Nintendo cartridges tapes. I know, like I said, it is confusing. But that's neither here nor there. Basically, it was just this store that you walked into, and it was just bins of sound recordings. 8-tracks, records, cassettes, or CDs. Later, audio super CDs, or some of them sold DVDs and video CDs and things like that. But for the most part, they were just they were sound recordings. Record stores. There were a few chains. The biggest, or at least most, basically the blockbuster video of record stores was Sam Goody. There were other chains out there, but Sam Goody was the one we remember most. The second record store chain, which I would say was the Hollywood Video of record stores, was Hastings. I think that's a pretty apt analogy. Don't do it. It's not an apples to oranges analogy. It's not a perfect analogy. It's more like apples to bananas. They're like both technically juicy plant products that you can eat. But that's where the comparisons stop. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves. But anyways, basically Sam Goody was like the big fancy corporate chain inside your shopping malls that primarily focused on like the mainstream hits, and then they would occasionally have like some more obscure stuff, curated stuff, various different sections, and then they would have things like, originally VHS tapes and later DVDs and video CDs and laser discs of anime and horror shows, and they would sometimes sell video games and comic book related stuff and that sort of stuff. Hastings did the same thing, but on a different type of scale. Like I said, whereas Sam Goody was primarily the top 40 hits, the mainstream stuff, with, pretty broad enough selection that you could find some of the indie stuff and obscure stuff. Sure. Hastings was way more eclectic. Hastings was where it was at. If you were looking for some hyper-local band that nobody has ever heard of because they were only able to press 500 CDs in your local market, your best bet was Hastings. Sam Goody probably didn't give that band or their label the time of day. Another major difference between Sam Goody and Hastings was Sam Goody operated kind of like Walmart and Target, as in they were just a distributor or the endpoint retailer that the record store distributors would drop their product off, and they were basically the point of sale. They operated the same as Walmart, Kmart, Target, everybody else. They just stocked CDs. They brought them in on a truck, put them on the shelf, rang them up, and sold them to you. Hastings did the same thing, but they also operated more similar to your independent local record store or your pawn shop or your comic book or your used retro video game store, in that you could take CDs that you already owned and had listened to and got bored of to Hastings and trade them in, and they would, slap a used sticker on them at a discounted price, put them on the shelf, and sell them as well. So you had way more variety in Hastings because you literally had no idea what they were going to take. You could walk into Hastings and walk around the record bin for hours discovering music. Not so much at Sam Goody. Now, there were also, like I mentioned previously, just like you had Blockbuster and Hollywood Video, you also had your mom and pop shops. Yes, there were also local record stores as well, local independent record stores as well. And there were other chains too. Those were just the two biggest ones. And your retailers, your Walmart, Kmart, Target, Shopko, Dollar General, etc., they all sold CDs and cassettes and stuff too. Some of them, well, the ones that are still around, I should say, kind of sort of still do, but not like they used to. But it's a different time. Obviously, times have changed. Spotify and YouTube and Amazon and Apple have changed all that. But anyways, yeah, we're in the digital age now. But anyways, I never went to Sam Goody. Mostly because they were too expensive. Because they were in the mall. And also because I was not usually looking for the mainstream stuff. I usually got that stuff at Target because it was cheaper at Target than it was at Sam Goody. So if I wanted like a Beastie Boys album or, Will Smith or something, I'd get it at Target because, it was a fair price. Whereas at Sam Goody, it'd be like $5 or $6 more. If I was looking for something obscure, or I was looking for like a Beastie Boys punk rock EP from back in the day, or I was looking for some electronic, techno, house, trance, electronica, drum and bass, or whatever, you weren't going to find it Sam Goody. I had better chances of finding that stuff at Hastings. Also, because Hastings sold used CDs, and because they were typically not downtown, but they were typically also not in the mall. They were usually in like your standard shopping plazas, with like your payday loan stores and your dollar store and a bank in the parking lot and stuff like that. Maybe a Burger King on the corner or something. They didn't have as high rent, overhead, etc. So their prices were lower in general. But also because they were selling used CDs, you could get a really good deal on used CDs. Now, while most places I lived that did have a record store, either a Sam Goody or a Hastings or both, usually had a local independent mom and pop shop as well, I personally avoided those places because they were the opposite. They were not selling the mainstream stuff, but they also weren't selling, like, they were usually selling more obscure stuff, but they were also selling more, like, curated stuff. And so I wasn't into that, because it was like, they were snobs, basically, is what I'm getting at. They assumed that you were going to have a certain taste in music, and if you didn't have that same taste in music as they did, you weren't welcome in those stores. Now, obviously, iPods and later iPhones and smartphones and Spotify and the internet and everything else, record stores have basically gone extinct. And it was not a slow death. Sam Goody went out of business real quick. Hastings limped along because they had a more diversified product line, because they also sold instruments and computer games and rented DVDs and sold comic books and trading cards and all kinds of stuff. So they were able to limp along a little bit longer, probably considerably longer than they realistically should have been able to. But ultimately, they ended up going broke as well. Because after a while, people just stopped shopping there. What's the point, Right here. I get all my music right here on Spotify. Yeah, obviously you can see we got records, we got CDs in this house. I've got a record player somewhere. I have actual vinyl records and cassette tapes and hundreds and hundreds of actual physical compact discs. But I don't need them. They're just things that I just have chosen not to throw out yet.